Hello and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series of episodes describing various aspects of keyframe animation. In episode 6, part 1, I dealt with the fundamental mechanisms of keyframe animation in Title Studio. I also demonstrated a simple example of an animated lower third. In this episode, I'll demonstrate the creation of a more complex animated lower third. As I mentioned in part 1, I'll refer to keyframe animation as keyframing in this tutorial. Please note that I'm using Title Studio within Continuum 2022. Your version's UI may be slightly different. For the intro, I want a text background strip to expand vertically from nothing, then the lower third text to slide in from the left. For the outro, I want the same sequence but in reverse. I'm using the same video event as with the example in part 1. So, to start with the background strip. This will be a spline primitive with a border. It will be filled in with a reduced opacity color gradient. The gradient will go from opaque to transparent at the right-hand side. I can now use the Scale and Translate tools to size and move it to a suitable place. With the background strip placed, I can proceed to fill it with a suitable colour. To do this, select the Material Texture entry, then Controls. Select the Fill tab and make sure that the Fill On checkbox is checked. Click the Fill Type drop-down and select Gradient, then the Gradient swatch. Now, I want the right-hand end to be transparent, so I'll select the Node 2 color option and wind the alpha value down to 0. Now I'll move Node 2 to the end of the color bar as far as it'll go. I want the transparency to progress along the strip, so I'll bring Node 1 to the left end of the color bar. I'll now make the Node 1 color into something that'll contrast nicely with the video background. As my video is mostly green, I think I'll choose a light grey. Some adjustments may be needed, so to save time I'll load one I prepared earlier. Finally, I'll give the whole rectangle some transparency. I can do this by adjusting the fill opacity parameter in the fill window. I don't need much, so 90% will do. I want the background to have a border, so I'll select the Border tab. I'll place a check mark in the first border checkbox, then change the edge width to a suitable value such as 10. The colour will be white. Finally, to complete the feather effect at the end of the strip, I have to do something about the border there. There's a neat feature called Crop Texture, but you have to select the Shader texture entry to find it. With this entry selected, open up the Crop Texture tab and adjust the right parameter value to cut off the border at the end of the strip. I'll enter 70. You can diffuse the border further by adjusting the Softness Right parameter value. I'll enter 5. Now for the lower third text. I suggest that you collapse the rectangle track tree for now. With the scene entry selected, add a new flat text entry. If you don't want the text to be the default white, select the colour swatch in the text window and select your desired colour. I'm going to leave it white. Now to modify the text string. Because I'm using the same video sequence as in part 1, I'll enter the same description. I now need to move the text into position. As is the case here, you may need to reduce the font size. I could reduce the top line font size, then the bottom, but instead I'll use the master scale parameter in the shape position window. Alternatively, you could reduce the size with the Scale Interactor tool. Now for the animation. I want the strip to expand vertically around its center line. The lower third text will then enter from off the display on the left. After a few seconds, the text will retract back off the display and the background strip will then collapse. To save time, I've worked out the timings and entered them into the User Marks window. In order to concentrate on the background strip alone, it's a good idea to hide the text object. You can do this by clicking the track visibility icon on the shape track entry. With the rectangle entry selected and the CTI at the start of the timeline, I can create a keyframe. At this keyframe, the background strip will be completely collapsed, so I'll use the Scale Y parameter to do that. But before I do that, I need to make a note of the Scale Y value, as I'll need this shortly. I want this position held until the first keyframe, so I'll set the interpolation mode to hold. I'll now move the CTI to the first user mark and create a keyframe. At this point, the strip is still collapsed, but I want it to start expanding. To do this, the interpolation mode needs changing to linear. At the next user mark, the strip needs to be fully expanded, so I'll create a keyframe and increase the scale Y parameter by entering the value I noted earlier. With the strip fully expanded, I need it to stay expanded, so I'll change the interpolation mode to hold. Now I need to go to the user mark that indicates the start of the strip collapse. At this point, the strip is still expanded, but I want it to start collapsing, so I'll create a keyframe and change the interpolation mode to linear. This mark signifies the end of the animation, so I'll create a keyframe and set the scale Y parameter to 0. As I want it to stay at 0 now, I'll change the interpolation mode to hold. It's a good idea at this point to check out the animation. Now for the text. Using the same techniques as with the background strip, I'll utilize the user marks to create keyframes. As with the background strip, I'll make a note of the position X value, as I'll need this later on. At the start of the timeline, the text will be fully off the display on the left, so I'll create a keyframe and move the text left until it's fully off the display. Now I want the text to stay off the display until the appropriate user mark, so I'll set the interpolation mode of position X to hold. At this user mark, I'll create a keyframe. The text will still be off the display, but I want it to start moving onto the display, so the interpolation mode of this keyframe needs to be linear. At this point, the text should be fully in position, so I'll create a keyframe and enter the value I noted down earlier into the position X parameter. The text needs to stay in this position until the next appropriate user mark, so the interpolation mode needs to be hold. Now I'll move to the next mark. At this mark, the text should start to slide out, so I'll create a keyframe and set it to linear. Now to move to the next mark, where the text should be fully off the display. Now, as you get used to keyframing, you can start using little shortcuts that will save you time. In this instance, I want the text to be fully off the display at this keyframe, and it's fairly easy to do that. But in some cases, it may not be so easy, so it's a good idea to get used to these shortcuts. I know that at one of the user marks, the text is fully off the display, so I can step back using Alt-J to find the appropriate keyframe. I can then right-click the keyframe and select Copy Keyframe. Then I move back to the original keyframe with Alt-L and press Ctrl-V. The interpolation mode of this keyframe needs to be hold. I can now play the sequence to see if things are in order. Okay, so that's a slightly more complex example of an animated lower third. The rest is up to your creativity and time constraints. As an alternative to creating your own animated lower third, there are numerous built-in examples you can access via the FX browser. Pick one you fancy, load it in and modify it to suit your needs. In the next tutorial, I'm going to take a look at the built-in credit scroll and text scroll functions available in Title Studio. In the meantime, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. Until the next time, bye for now.